So you want to understand the tiny sensors that secretly control every flight you have ever taken. Not the engines, not the wings, not even the pilots in the cockpit, but a handful of small metal probes sticking out of the skin of the aircraft, some of them no bigger than your finger, that quietly decide almost everything the plane does. And here's the part that should unsettle you slightly. You probably think of an airliner as a machine that knows where it is, knows how fast it's going, knows how high it is. It doesn't. Not directly. It infers its entire understanding of reality from those few probes, and it trusts them completely. The most advanced aircraft in the world will calmly fly a falsehood straight into the ground if a sensor the size of a pen tells it to. These probes don't just inform the flight, they command it. Now, before we get to what these sensors actually do, we need to understand a problem so basic it sounds absurd. Because it isn't obvious. You might assume an aircraft simply knows how fast it's flying, the way your car knows its speed from a glance at the dashboard. It doesn't. It comes down to one strange fact. A plane has no direct way to measure its own speed through the air. Think about why. Your car measures speed by counting how fast its wheels turn against the road, but a plane in the air isn't touching anything. And more importantly, the speed it cares about isn't its speed over the ground at all. It's the speed of the air flowing over its wings, because that airflow is the only thing producing lift and keeping the machine airborne. A strong headwind or tailwind means the speed over the ground and the speed through the air can be wildly different. So the question becomes genuinely difficult. How do you measure how fast air is rushing past you when you are sitting inside the very thing moving through it? Here's the physics that matters. When you move forward through air, the air piles up against anything facing into the oncoming flow. Point a small open-ended tube directly forward, and the air rams into it, raising the pressure inside. The faster you go, the harder the air rams in, and the higher that pressure climbs. Now compare that to the pressure of the still, undisturbed air off to the side. The difference between the two, the rammed-in pressure and the static pressure, tells you exactly how fast you are moving through the air. That forward-facing tube is called a pitot tube. The side openings are the static ports. Two tiny holes, and the difference between them is your airspeed. So airspeed is really just a pressure comparison from a couple of small openings, which immediately raises the question, if these are just little pressure sensors, why would anyone call them the things that control the entire flight? This is where these probes stop being simple instruments and become the master input for the whole aircraft. To understand it, you need one idea. A modern airliner is flown by its computers, and those computers act on whatever the sensors tell them. The autopilot doesn't hold your speed and altitude by feel. It holds them by reading the pitot tubes and static ports thousands of times a second and adjusting the aircraft to match. If those readings drift, the autopilot drifts with them, perfectly obedient to a number that may no longer be true. The fly-by-wire systems that protect the plane from going too slow and stalling rely on another small sensor entirely, the angle of attack vane, a little blade on the side of the fuselage that swivels freely in the airflow to measure the exact angle at which the wing is meeting the oncoming air. That angle is arguably the single most important number in all of flight because it determines whether the wing is still generating lift or is about to stop generating it and stall. Get within a few degrees of that limit and the aircraft is in danger, and the only way the computers know how close they are is that one small swiveling blade. These sensors don't just feed a display for the pilots to glance at. They feed the automation that physically moves the controls. The aircraft does what the sensors say. That is the secret. The plane does not truly know how fast it is going, or how high it is, or how close its wing is to giving up. It knows what a few centimeters of metal probe tell it, and it stakes the lives of everyone aboard on those numbers being true. Now, this isn't a hypothetical. On the 1st of June 2009, an Air France Airbus A330 was crossing the Atlantic at night, deep over the ocean, when it flew into a band of storms. In those freezing, turbulent clouds, ice crystals built up and blocked the pitot tubes. For a couple of minutes, those small forward-facing openings could no longer measure the airflow correctly, and the airspeed readings became unreliable and contradictory. The autopilot, unable to trust the data it was being fed, did exactly what it was designed to do. It disconnected and handed control back to the pilots, and in the dark, with conflicting readings and no outside reference, the crew became confused, pulled the nose up when they should have lowered it, and held the aircraft in an aerodynamic stall all the way down into the sea. Everyone on board was lost, 228 people. For an aircraft full of passengers, that is the nightmare these tiny sensors can produce. And here is the haunting part. The aircraft itself was never broken. The engines worked, the wings worked. The structure was perfectly sound. A few millimeters of ice, blocking a couple of small tubes, was enough to unravel everything. because the entire machine was built to believe what those tubes told it. There are other ways this goes wrong, and they are humblingly small. An aircraft parked for weeks had a wasp build a nest inside an uncovered pitot tube, blocking it, and the false readings that followed contributed to a fatal crash. Another aircraft was cleaned on the ground and had tape placed over its static ports, which was never removed before flight, feeding the crew false altitude and speed until they flew into the ocean. And in the most well-known recent example, a single faulty angle of attack vane fed bad data to an automated system on a modern airliner, which repeatedly and forcefully pushed the nose down against the pilots, contributing to 2 separate crashes. The pattern is always the same: a tiny sensor giving a wrong answer, and an aircraft that believed it without question. That is why these probes are not left to chance. Aircraft carry multiple pitot tubes, multiple static ports, and multiple angle of attack sensors, deliberately scattered across both sides of the nose, all cross-checked against one another so that a single bad reading can be caught and outvoted by the others. The pitot tubes are electrically heated to melt away ice in flight, drawing serious power to do it. On the ground, they are capped with bright red covers trailing long warning flags, specifically so that nobody walking around the aircraft can forget they are there. Pilots physically check them during their walk-around inspection before every flight. An astonishing amount of engineering and procedure exists purely to protect a few small openings from ice, insects, tape, and simple human forgetfulness. So calling these sensors the things that secretly control the flight is not an exaggeration. It is not a dramatic flourish. Everything downstream, the pilot's instruments, the autopilot, the fly-by-wire protections, the warnings that scream when the aircraft is in danger, is only ever as true as the handful of probes feeding it. The towering complexity of a modern airliner, all of it, rests on a few pressure readings taken from openings you could cover with your thumb. Aircraft do build in layers of redundancy and protection to guard against this, and the systems are extraordinarily reliable the overwhelming majority of the time. But the underlying truth never changes. The data has to come from somewhere physical, and that somewhere is small, exposed, and out in the open air, vulnerable to anything that can block a tiny hole. And physics enforces that dependence without exception. Here is what makes this worth understanding. The sensor question seems like a trivial one: a few small probes, how important could they be? And the simple answer would be, they're just instruments. But the real answer is that the most sophisticated flying machine humanity has ever built still has to physically reach out and touch the air to learn anything at all about its own flight, through openings you could block with a fingertip, and then trust what it finds there absolutely. The control is not where you would think to look for it. It is not in the roar of the engines or the glow of the cockpit screens. At a certain point, all of it, every command the aircraft gives itself, traces back to a few small probes sitting in the freezing slipstream, quietly measuring the pressure of the air. And the aircraft, for all its sophistication, for all its computers and redundancy and decades of refinement, is ultimately only ever as right as those probes allow it to be. Think about what that means for a moment. Every single flight you have ever taken, every smooth cruise, every gentle hold at altitude, every automated descent, was being guided the entire time by a handful of tiny sensors out in the cold, and a machine that trusted them with everything. You never saw them, you never thought about them, but they were quietly steering the whole experience, the comfort, the safety, the routine of it, from a few square centimeters of metal exposed to the wind. That's not a limit of engineering. That is what it looks like when the most complex machine we know how to build still has to ask the wind how fast it's going, and stake everything on the answer.